we need to remember that the characters that we're writing are characters. They're not real people. They aren't real beings, but they are characters in a story. With that being said, the point of even stating that is that we need to understand that these characters are going to act in a certain way to service the narrative. We need to do what is right and choose how the characters can better influence and impact and create a more compelling case for the story that we're telling. This might mean accentuating them on certain aspects of the story, or certain themes, or certain concepts that we might want to explore or use in this story. What can they embody or represent to make for a more interesting story? And is it in the best interest to make that character more likable on the page? In terms of likability, we don't want to fall into the trap of using cheap tricks to make a character a likable character. A lot of the times we fall into this trap when we make a character overtly benevolent, making them be too good and have these overarching or even overwhelming acts of kindness. If they're charming, they're skilled, and they're good at everything, they are also can sometimes feel like a paragon of what a person can be, making them unrelatable and also unlikable. We don't want to make them a superstar that is a loving parent or a doted child or that is kind to any and all types of animals. We can include these things if they're important to the story and the plot, but we don't want to use these sort of cheap tricks to create likability tokens for our audience. To get into one of the first useful bits of information or tips is to make this character relatable. And more specifically, we want to understand what about them might reflect the viewer or the reader. What is going to set them apart and make them noticeable and make them feel like the viewer or the reader or our audience at large can relate to this character. Your audience should see a reflection of some part of them as something that they can empathize with. Building empathy and sympathy is part of the writing process to make a reader or a audience member invested in that character. This can be achieved by giving your characters everyday struggles, dreams, and even quirks or bits of their own background that someone might share with them. Giving a character also a compelling universal desire is something that is also can be relatable. But to go through and name a whole list of things that might be relatable or that you might be able to use to create that sense of relatability is kind of pointless. I will name a few things and I will name a few tropes that can kind of get the ideas going. But the problem is that there are countless things that can be considered relatable. This can be a relationship with a parent or a loved one or a spouse. It can also be a lack of a relationship with all of those things. There is a positive and a negative sort of relatability that we can use when it comes to establishing this sympathetic bond between your audience and a character. Some tropes that are universal and commonly used can be a rags to riches story, or even a riches to rags story. In a similar way, ordinary to extraordinary. We often see or think to ourselves that we are all ordinary people that want to do or be a part of something extraordinary. We can also relate to the fish out of water or even the outsider trope, which this one I am particularly fond of just because of the way in which we can build around a character in a shared experience with the viewer or reader. And that shared experience being the lack of knowledge of this new place, or experience or location. And even too, we can think of just a normal everyday experience that most of us might always have, whether that's going to work or having a difficult boss, and then including that and having the character experience that as well. What sort of human and universal reaction or feeling do they have towards these everyday things? There's a balance that we need to have when it comes to giving our characters these ordinary and universal experiences. On one hand, they're there to establish empathy and build a bond and buy-in with your audience. And on the other, they're there to continue to progress and move the plot. We don't want to get so bogged down on building this character that is relatable on a very ordinary level to then slow down the pacing of our story or make them feel so mundane that we don't end up caring so much about them. Try to focus on the character's experience that they might embody the most. Or you can even ask your character what it is that they or how they identify themselves. What universal traits would that character resonate with if they were reading a story and they were to consider themselves in a similar regard? This element is one that I think is the most important to include when it comes to creating characters and making characters feel likable and even relatable. The biggest thing here is to give your character some kind of flaw. Writing paragons or pinnacles of virtue are often less interesting outside of certain scenarios than reading about a character that is struggling with something. We give them something to overcome and something to feel vulnerable about. And it's within those vulnerabilities and even within those flaws that our characters can often come off on the page as being more likable. Having someone that we understand on a literary level and having them struggle and overcome these things, little obstacles or larger ones, are often what make a reader relate to and want to root for that character. This also comes in terms of giving your character small achievable goals to make it seem that the lofty, more grand goal is more achievable and within their grasp. Having a character want to save the world but can't even defend themselves from a schoolyard bully is not someone who we will necessarily have a lot of trust in. But giving that character the goal of trying to save the world and in the process stops a bully or breaks up a fight or defends a classmate, we can now see this character being able to achieve that. But in achieving these goals, there's vulnerability and flaws that they might have to overcome along the way. In the instance of standing up to a bully, perhaps our character has struggled in the past with standing up to authority or even self-advocating for themselves. Probably one of my favorite examples of a flawed character that you almost love indefinitely is in the movie Banshee of Inisherin. Paddock, played by Colin Farrell, is a chatty and even annoying character to many of the other characters.
But you didn't say anything to me. And you didn't do anything to me.
Well, that's what I was thinking, like.
I just don't like you no more.
But despite this flaw, they are extremely lovable. And we, as in the audience, feels for that character. They just want to have their best friend back to talk about nothing. Now, there's a lot more symbolism that goes into the relationship between Paddock and Colum, mostly being a symbolic representation, perhaps, of the civil war that is going on at the time. But we can still feel for and relate to this character, despite that flaw or that sense of vulnerability. A great way that I sometimes like to think up flaws, or at least create the rough outline of giving a character a flaw, often I will look at the 7 deadly sins as a place of inspiration. Now, there's more flaws and there's more things a character can be vulnerable about than just the Catholic 7 deadly sins. But it is a good starting place to strip down a character from a paragon-like status and instead give them something to be vulnerable over. It is always one of my biggest bits of advice for writers to make a character feel likable and relatable. Outweighing virtues with vices can often be the surefire way of making a character relatable and also making them more likable, despite it feeling or even appearing to be counterintuitive. The final point that I'll make on making a character more likable is have them act realistically and truthfully, and do so with a level of conviction. Oftentimes, characters who do nothing but have a middle-of-the-road stance or have stances where they flip-flop and go back and forth between different positions that they might hold are often the ones that are the most unlikable, or it isn't even that they are unlikable, they can just be neither liked nor disliked. And I would argue that that can sometimes be worse. Having a character that isn't hated or isn't loved is often the death sentence to a character's purpose and memorability in a story. I always suggest, and something that I always try to do, is give a character a strong stance on something. What is something that they care deeply about, and what is that thing that they will defend and be almost irrationally immovable on? This gives a lot of opportunity for either character arc moments or gives a lot of opportunity to create conflict and tension. You've heard me a lot use the concept of true love being something of a contention point. You can have a whole line of characters that believe in true love, don't believe in true love, and then have them sort of factionize and almost battle it out on those points. Some will change, some won't change, some will double down. This is where we can start to establish our characters being representations of the themes that we might have in our story. If we follow the previously mentioned points on our list here, we can have our characters act realistically and truthfully to them. Given their flaws, given their virtues, given their expertise, given their background, all of these things can help influence them in their decision that they have to make in your story. It will be whatever feels right for that character that will influence them on the stances, the positions, and the actions that they take in the narrative. And remember, we want to keep our characters as characters. They are characters in a story that will be there to embody certain aspects of that story. Readers should be able to look back at a decision that one made and see their track record of who they are, where they're from, and the information you've given them on the page, and think to themselves that it makes sense that they acted this way. Even though they might not agree with an action that a character has taken, they can at least understand it. Now, this is where I see a lot of times even the most loyal and faithful fandoms revolting, and it is often comes down to characters acting outside of their characters. They are acting outside of what is true for that character. We want to avoid this, and that is often easier said than done, because sometimes we need the plot to move in a certain way, or we need the story to progress in some other aspect. But we should try and manipulate something else than break the characters. Because at the end of the day, the characters are the things that our audience are going to relate and sympathize with the most. They aren't going to sympathize with the plot. They aren't going to sympathize with the setting. It's the characters that they sympathize with. And remember that conviction equals agency. Agency is the thing that our audience will connect with and understand and appreciate. A character who lacks agency is at the whims of the plot, or at the whims of whatever narrative direction you want to go. Agency helps with immersion, and it helps with being invested in the story and the outcome of the different characters that you have on the page. Creating likable characters is a bit of an art. It's not easy, and it sometimes isn't always the most fun. We often have to kill a lot of our darlings or create monsters out of characters that we truly loved. But it involves interweaving the flaws and the virtues, the strong stances and the conviction and the agency. All of these things go into creating a character that is likable and relatable. And if you can master the ability to create a likable character, despite their flaws, and despite their strong stances, and despite the decisions they make, then you've probably made a pretty good character. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you're wrestling with. Is it easy for you to make a likable character, or are likable characters sometimes something that you struggle with? Do you have any other topics or anything else that you would want me to cover? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.